Okay, in the last section, we were talking about the things the Chinese policymakers and the whole country did right during the past 3.5 decades, enabling the economy to grow very fast. Naturally, we ask ourselves, is the past path of rapid growth sustainable? Aren't there challenges facing the Chinese economy? So in this section, we will talk about mounting challenges, not just challenges, mounting challenges facing the Chinese society and the economy. There are many, many challenges facing the Chinese economy. Sometimes I was thinking that I would like to be an occupant of Zhongnanhai. That guy living there in Chinese White House must be under tremendous pressure, maybe even bigger than President Obama, because so many problems in China. What are they? In order to be brief, because I can spend hours or days talking about the challenges, let me talk about only the following few. First challenge is search for new engine of growth, because the Chinese economy is slowing down from what used to be over 10% of growth to nowadays around 7%. 7% is not slow, but in our Chinese minds it's slow. And more important, the trend is rather uncomfortable. It's slowing down. So people are asking, where are the new engines of growth? Well, the old engines of growth were investment and export. As I told you, since China's entry into WTO, China's share in the international trade increased from 5% to 12% of the whole world. But nowadays, international trade is a negative factor to Chinese growth. Trade is diminishing share of Chinese economy. Rather, to be specific, to be precise, trade surplus is diminishing share of the Chinese economy. In other words, the Chinese trade surplus, which is export minus import, which is the amount of goods that world consumers are helping the Chinese producers to consume. This number as a share of Chinese GDP is coming down from what used to be 8.8% of GDP to nowadays only 2.5% of GDP. Export, I would argue, can no longer be counted on as our new engine of growth. Why? Because China is no longer a small cat, the economy. It's an elephant. How can the world accommodate such a big elephant in its export? So export is no longer counted on. Investment used to be over 50% of the share of the growth of China. Is still slowing down. The hope is consumption. Consumption is gradually coming up. As of 2013 and 2014, consumption is almost equal as investment, as a contributor to GDP. But the people are still worried. Will consumption be able to come up quickly to make up the loss of export and investment? That's the first challenge facing China. Second challenge, perhaps even more urgent than search for new engine of growth, is to deal with so-called bubbles. What are the bubbles? People outside China are very concerned. People inside China are also very concerned. The first sign of bubble is debt. Here is a chart put together by an investment bank in the US, calculating the ratio of China's total debt, public debt, enterprise debt, household debt, divided by Chinese GDP. That number increased very fast, roughly doubled in the past 80 years. Nowadays, by their calculation, it is as high as 240% of GDP. Now, frankly, this number, 240% of GDP in the amount of debt, is not the highest in the world. In the US, this equivalent number would be 300%. Japan, I would believe, is even higher. But people were right. I think people are right outside China in pointing out the fact that it is the fast pace of the increase of this ratio that worries people, indeed. So how to dissolve this potential problem? Because behind this number, you can imagine there are potentially a lot of non-performing debt. Commercial banks not being able to recover their debt. This is a challenge. I call bubble. People say this is a bubble. Some people may even go as far as saying China is the biggest bubble, bigger than Japan before its Japanese economic problem 20 years ago. Yet another sign of bubble is this picture. This picture shows us buildings, high-rise buildings, empty and unfinished. In which part? In a part which used to be prosperous in China, producing coal. It's called Ordos in China. It's in Inner Mongolia, rich in coal. But nowadays, when the economy slows down, the coal price is coming down. About 50% of what it used to be. This city, this coal capital, is empty in economic activities. This town, people say, used to be prosperous, is now ghost town. This is a sign of the potential bursting of China's property market. Another sign of Chinese property market being a bubble is that it takes at least 15 or even 20 years for an average young couple in the city of Beijing or Shanghai to be able to buy a modest apartment in Beijing or Shanghai. That is, the housing price is way beyond the affordability of young people in Chinese cities. This indicates that the housing price may be a bubble. And people argue that maybe in 10 or maybe in 5 years, when people like Imagine generation are beginning to retire, with the policy of one child per family, there will be 4 couples on both sides of a young couple. There are 4 parents, right, passing their apartments to a young couple. In 5 or 10 years, many young couples in China will have to deal with a lot of apartments. They have no time to occupy. So people are arguing that housing price may come down even more drastically than in Japan. So this is potentially a bubble. The third challenge is social tension. There are multiple dimensions of social tension. One source of social tension is inequality. China is not society of immigration. What's the implication? The implication is that people tend to compare with each other. In the US, people come from different origins. People don't try to understand each other's income. In China, when you meet somebody, especially in Chinese Spring Festival or Chinese New Year, people would ask you how much you earn, and they tend to compare. If you say you are earning a high amount number, people become envious. If you see a no number, people may look down upon you. It's dilemma. Anyway, inequality is a potential problem, bigger than the US socially, psychologically, because people expect a more equal society. And in this chart, we have a poor village buried in the middle of fancy cities. So imagine people living in the middle of fancy cities in poor conditions, how they think. So inequality is a problem. Another problem, which you all know, is corruption. Look at this picture. This is an official of a local government in China doing what? Well, he's inspecting something. And here is another picture. Same guy. You recognize him, right? Summer costume, right? In the summertime. And yet another picture of this guy. And yet even more picture of this guy. But why do I put them together? Look, one critical detail. The watch. In 4 pictures, the same official wore different kinds of watch. I'm not an expert of watch. I wear a very simple one, electronic one, right? So I don't recognize, but there are smart people in China who would carefully study the watches. And they claim that all these watches are super expensive watches. Perhaps people can only buy from Switzerland. So why this guy is able to own at least 4 pieces of expensive watches? Maybe he has more. Indeed, people later found out he had more. He has lots of watches. So this guy was later on under investigation as of why, with his modest income as government officials, and able to own so many fancy watches. He got many watches in his home, in his house. This is a corrupt official. So this guy is so famous in China, we call him Uncle Watch. Uncle Watch is not small in number. They are uncle apartments. People accumulate many apartments. There are many, many more Uncle Cash. There's one guy who discovered to be corrupt official. And the prosecutor went to his house and they found cash after cash. So they had to bring in lots of cash counting machines, right? And there's so much amount of cash that they have to bring 10 cash counting machines. 9 of them broke down, working too hard. So this is a sign of Chinese social discontent. People are not always trusting government officials. Corruption is one thing. Even more important than corruption is the distrust of the government. We're talking about distrust of government. Here comes the big issue, the air quality. The last days of February of 2015, China got an explosive video on the internet. How many visits of this video? 170 million, and still going on as of today. What is the video? The video was produced by a former anchor lady of Chinese Central TV. The topic is air pollution. She was talking in the style of Vice President Gore. Vice President Gore was talking about global warming. She was talking about air pollution in China. And she put together piles of facts about the causes, the consequences, and the most important, the implied lack of action of the government in dealing with air pollution. And that video is the most popular video nowadays, produced by an independent investigator. In the US, imagine, or in UK or in Europe or in other parts of the world, imagine if the independent producer talks about pollution. The fingers, I would say, would be pointed at multinationals, corporates, right? So corporates are not doing social responsibility. But in China, whenever there are problems like this, the fingers are pointed at the government, local and central, ministries and bureaus. So every problem in China fundamentally is a problem of the government. Why? Because the government, I would argue, promised a lot. When you promise a lot, we have a problem, people come back to you asking for solutions. This is a challenge in China. Yet there's another form of social tension in China, that is ethnic unrest. China is a country consisting of multiple ethnic groups. Some of them are believers of Islamic. In part of China, in Xinjiang, for various reasons, there are violent actions. In this picture, victims were being cured by medical experts. as many as 70 people were either wounded or even killed in a railroad station in southern part of China, in Kunming, by a few Xinjiang ethnic minority people. Many things going on. The Chinese government's policy dealing with ethnic minority groups, I'm understating, is not optimal, causing all these problems. This is yet another sign of social tension. The fourth challenge facing China is international tension and, as a consequence, nationalism. This is a picture of a man trying to throw a water bottle at what? At a Japanese military boat. What are they doing? This young man, looks like a young man, is a nationalist, is a patriotic person by Chinese definition, trying to go to the so-called Diaoyu Island in southern China. And that island is, as a fact, under dispute between China and the US. It's a long story. To make it very short, that islands, very small islands, actually it should be called rocks. That rocks used to be part of Taiwan. At the end of World War II, when the US was occupying Japan, the US military was using this island, these rocks, I call them rocks, as targets of military exercise. When they shoot, they use targets, right? And then around 1972, Dr. Henry Kissinger, then the Secretary of State of the US, began to negotiate diplomatic relationship with mainland China. He, as part of the US government, representing the US government, gave that island control to Japan, creating a potential point of dispute between China and Japan. At that time, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai put it very simply: let's do not talk about this issue. Let's put this issue aside. Today, China is emerging. Both inside China and outside China, people, for various reasons, are becoming less patient. They want to settle these issues. And here we have this picture. Whenever there are international issues, there are domestic consequences. What are they doing here? These are young people taking to the street, protesting against Japanese government on the Diaoyu Island issue. And yet there's a picture, here's a picture of a young man doing what? Hitting a car. What is car? You cannot recognize this because this car is upside down. It's a Honda. It's a Japanese brand, but made in China. It's a car made in China, bearing a Japanese brand. And these young people couldn't find a better place to vent out their anger. The young people couldn't find a better place to vent their anger. They vent the anger at the Japanese label the car, made in China. This is a Honda CR-V, actually. This is apparently irrational behavior, because the owner of the car is a Chinese national. So this young man is actually hurting the interest of a fellow countryman. The Japanese company is not hurt at all. This shows that nationalism, I think by definition, is irrational. So irrational factors in China can be a challenge down the road. Well, all the troubles are mounting. All the crises are mounting in China. Well, China has a hope. What will happen to China down the road? Extremely controversial issue. I would argue that when it comes to such a big issue, we have to look at the big pictures. We have to look at the fundamental factors, right? Rather than detailed things. What are the fundamental factors shaping the future of China? Well, in the economic dimension, there are a few. First, China is still a country with high savings rates, 50% of GDP, the highest amount of currency reserves. High savings rates, high currency reserves creates a foundation for the economy to deal with leverage, the high level of debt, to deal with bubbles. That's the first fact. Second fact, China is still a country with poor per capita income. China is still a country where the per capita income is very low, which indicates that people are still willing to work hard. Unlike, frankly speaking, today's Greece, or even part of Italy, people in China are still hungry. This means that people are still willing to learn. The third factor shaping the future of China is innovation. You asked about the innovation, right? Our student from Holland. Let's look at some early indications of indication. Where do we start? Patents. China is now number 1 in the world in terms of application for patents. Last year, passed Japan. Now you may think patents may be subjective, may not show any objective value. Let's talk about another thing. SCI. Do you know what does SCI stand for? Science Citation Index. This is the index of academic journals or scientific journals, not economics, scientific journals. Not that the economics is not science, right? But factually speaking, SCI does not cover economics. So China is now already number 2 in the world in producing science and technology papers cited by SCI index. To repeat, it means that the amount of scientific papers published in China, not by China national outside China, inside China, is already number 2, quickly catching up. China was number 8 in the SCI indexed papers about 15 years ago, now number 2. And the trend shows that China will become number 1, surpassing the US. Now you may ask, again, scientific papers are not always useful in terms of economic development and innovation. Well, a better index is citation. That is how many citations a paper gets. The more citation a paper gets means the paper is more important scientifically, right? Now this number, China is also very quickly catching up. China now is number 4 in scientific citation. So this, I think, are signs that China's innovation is quickly catching up. Yet another sign is education. China has a culture of emphasizing education. Remember I told you that starting about 1,000 years ago, China's emperors began to practice the institution. That is, poor kids can study hard, take exams, and then be appointed as senior officials in the government. So education is in the tradition. And China, in terms of education, is much better than countries like India. Here is an indication of how high China has achieved in terms of education. The adult literacy rate in China is around 95%, while in India this number is around 63%. And also in China, the tradition of engineering education is very strong. Tsinghua University, where we're standing here, is actually a leading university in educating engineers. So all these things combined, reasonably good education, scientific paper publication, poor per capita income, and high savings rate, and let alone the fact that China is still an open economy, tells us most likely China will continue to grow. Imagine if China follows the path of Korea, South Korea I mean, of course not North Korea, and Japan. The per capita income of China by 2050, by my calculation and my also research of my team, will reach as high as 70% per capita income-wise of the US. 70%. That means that China's total size of GDP will be around 2.8, close to 3 times as large as the US. Of course, this does not mean that Chinese economy will smoothly evolve down the road. There will be certainly troubles in the economy and society in China. But overall, there are major factors indicating continued overall growth of China.